I want to start by expressing my gratitude to Northwestern University and to my colleagues in the Department of Sociology and beyond, who've made this such a wonderful place to pursue my vocation, and also to the pioneering lady managers whose generosity made possible the chair I hold. I've been asked to reflect on the influences that shaped my intellectual history, and I've been lucky to have a long and rich life, so there's a great deal upon which to reflect. You'll notice that I did not end that last sentence with a preposition. That rule of grammar is only one of the things I learned from my father, Edgar Orloff. He was a journalist whose passion for writing and reporting on matters of social injustice were evident throughout his career, from his time as editor of the military newspaper in the Canadian Arctic during World War II, through his years at the Sun-Times, to his last job at the San Francisco Examiner. Writing lessons were part of daily life, woven into dinner conversations alongside discussions of politics and art. He offered editorial suggestions for most of what I wrote before he died too young in 1983 when I was finishing my PhD at Princeton. My career owes a lot to his high expectations and his direct support. Oh, sorry, always technology. Go. Is that coming up okay to read? Yes.
Yes.
All right, fine. This is Edgar. My mother's influence was also significant. Okay. In some ways I've long known about, and in some foundational but indirect ways I've only come to understand more recently. Okay, that's fine. She took me at the age of 10 in 1963 to my first political event, the March on Washington. The march inspired a lifelong interest in understanding what sustains the intolerable injustices that characterize too much of our world, and the forces that might produce social transformation. These are the pictures that my mother snapped while we were at the march. I grew up to the sound of marching, charging feet. It was just part of normal life to take the bus with my friends from our New Jersey suburb to New York City to take part in the scores of protests going on at the time. I read The Feminine Mystique soon after it came out, refused to take typing, to my regret, or home economics, and got into endless tussles with the authorities at my high school over the unequal treatment we girls faced, and for organizing strikes for peace. In what turns out to have been a critical turning point in my life, I was kicked off the student newspaper where I was an editor for writing an editorial against the Vietnam War, which my father had helped me write. I'd been planning to follow in his footsteps, but this set me off on a different path towards a PhD. This is, that, if you can recognize that man, it is Alan Alda, who lived in my little suburb at the peace march we were having, and Mrs. Stepansky, who was the one teacher who was something of an ally of mine in high school. I was admitted to the last women-only Radcliffe class. We were greeted with great resources and great expectations, but it was hard not to notice the inequalities, starting with the fact that we were only 1 in 4 undergrads. There was sexism in the theories we were taught. I remember an anthropology professor arguing that the behaviors of male-dominant species like baboons were the key to understanding human sex differences, portrayed as immutable. And I was inspired to find alternative ways to understand gender. There was no women's studies program, but I was reading widely in feminism and sought out the very few women professors in Harvard's ranks. Ruth Tringham, an archaeologist, that's her up in the corner there, was my first mentor. She introduced me to materialist theories of human history, also shaping the radicalism of the era. And the other pictures are my side activities while I was at Harvard, being part of various protests, one of my sociology buddies. Yet I wanted to study the contemporary West, which was at that time the province of sociology rather than anthropology. And in sociology, I found what became my disciplinary home. Also during this time, I met Paul, my life partner, who shared my political passions before becoming a poet. By my junior year, I thought I'd found the perfect vocation, professor. But by my senior year, I was convinced I wanted to get out of the ivory tower. An exhilarating and frustrating couple of years of union and community organizing in Boston followed, but it became clear to me that my comparative not organizing work. This sojourn away from academia accounts for a demographic oddity about my life, relatively young childbearing. Having dropped out of the academic track, I was spending my time with people having children in their early 20s, so Paul and I did too, and Joanna was born in 1978. I ended up at Princeton in the fall of 1980. I was not your typical graduate student, arriving after time spent on the factory floor with a 2-year-old child in tow. But as Joanna put it a few years later, Paul was not a watch-looker dad, but a poet who combined his writing with taking care of her. Paul and childcare, publicly subsidized, got me through grad school as student and mother. Oops. There we go. That's Paul preaching his poetry at Rahway Prison and a hike in Northern California, Joe Paul. In grad school, fortuitously, my first-year advisor convinced me to offer a comment on a panel on Theda Skocpol's blockbuster, States and Social Revolutions. She was at the Institute for Advanced Study that year and asked me to be her RA. She became my mentor and collaborator. In the early 1980s, we wrote Why Not Equal Protection, a comparison of the early years of welfare provision in the US and Britain. And my interest in explaining US exceptionalism and politics and policy continues to this day. Gender only became the main focus of my work sometime later when I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I had my first job. In the midst of very passionate debates drawing on Marx and Weber to understand capitalism, states, and politics, a number of us asked, but what about male domination? Mainstream scholars questioned whether states could counteract the deleterious processes of commodification in capitalist labor markets. I wanted to theorize the relationship between states and gender. Calling on sociological theories, the sociology of gender, and feminist theory, I argued that states' contribution to the capacity to form and maintain an autonomous household for women critically shaped gender relations, a kind of parallel to the mainstream notion of decommodification. My research on comparative gendered politics and policy has taken me to a lot of wonderful places, Northwestern and this chair, Stockholm, which is kind of the center of international welfare state research, but luckily also Florence, where I spent time at the European University Institute and learned a lot about the comparative strengths and weaknesses of different systems. My current project compares women's movements in policy transformation over the course of the last century in the US and Sweden. I begin with the late 19th and early 20th century, the formative years of the welfare state. Women reformers, both educated professionals and club women, wanted to establish better social protections for mothers and children, a movement that's been recently dubbed maternalism. They were the contemporaries and usually allies of the suffragists, all of them making claims for equality, either articulated with gender difference or in more universalistic registers. Reformers demanded government action to address the special vulnerabilities of poor mothers in an era when destitution was the fate of almost any woman who lost access to a breadwinner's wage through his death, disability, desertion, or drinking problem. Unmarried mothers were faced with bad options. Their families were usually already overstretched. Charities demanded they take up employment, frequently as domestic servants, but this forced them to put their children in orphanages. Capitalizing on increasing sentiment that mothers and children should be kept together, maternalist reformers fought for and won mothers' pensions, which gave allowances to mostly widowed mothers in most states. Yet they were entirely inadequate, however politically significant. The benefits were low, and few women were covered given stingy financing. A few settlement houses offered day nurseries, but alas, this innovation was limited. Not until the New Deal did the government institutionalize help for poor single mothers, though this was only somewhat less limited than the mother's pensions. And crucially, extensive child care services were not part of these policies, reinforcing women's responsibility for child care and limiting their work opportunities. Today's policies, though changed in many ways, still reflect some of these same inadequacies. These reform reform movements of the early 20th century helped to open greater space for women's participation in social life, as in the case of the Board of Lady Managers. You know from the dean's introduction that they donated resources and provided leadership for the School of Domestic Arts and Sciences, which operated between 1901 and 1943. This is a picture of an article that appeared in the Chicago Tribune about the founding of the school. You get a flavor for the science of domestic work that it was providing, and I thank Tony Chen, my colleague in sociology, who tracked down this article for me. The school enrolled a broad cross-section of women, from society brides to working girls, in classes teaching the skills of scientific housekeeping. In the absence of adequate wages or childcare services and widespread discrimination in the job market, most women would depend economically on their husbands, but they could be better prepared for their socially significant work in the home. Now, I've traced my explicit intellectual influences since the early 1990s in the context of the edited volume Remaking Modernity, which Jim referenced, and again in Remaking Power and Politics, which was a presidential address to the Social Science History Association, an organization to which I owe a great deal. But I now know there were also subterranean forces calling me to the study of gender and states. And for whatever capacities I have to tap these energies, I can thank an early exposure to psychoanalysis and work on the psychic dimensions of gender by scholars like Jacqueline Rose, Juliet Adams, and Carolyn Steedman, whose Landscape for a Good Woman, an intellectual and personal reconstruction of her mother's political sympathies and life choices, was hugely influential. This takes me back to my mother, Kathleen Ward Orloff, and my grandmother, Florence Dixon. As a child, I had some notion of how hard their early lives had been, but they hadn't shared some of the painful but critical experiences they endured. It took me a long time to patch together what had happened to my mother and grandmother, relying on sketchy recollections and reading my grandmother's diary, which was organized as a perennial diary with entries for different years under the same month and day. It was only when a friend, who's an amateur genealogist, got it transcribed and listed chronologically just a couple of years ago that I figured out what had happened, and this is what it looked like before it at all these things had been mixed together in the years and couldn't really see what the trajectory was. And don't worry, you don't need to read that. I will be telling you about it. Florence often described her marriage to my grandfather, James Ward, as romantic but doomed to trouble. He was an Irish Catholic, she was English Protestant. That was only the start of it. Their first child, James Jr., died in 1924 when Florence was already pregnant with my mother. James left Florence and 3-year-old Kathleen sometime around Christmas 1928 for no reason I ever learned about, perhaps fleeing from the burdens of breadwinning and his misery at the loss of his firstborn son. The only way my grandmother could manage was to go out to work. In the absence of public childcare, she was forced to board my mother with her teachers. Kathleen then had a bout of scarlet fever and almost died. I now believe that the circumstances of single motherhood were at least partly responsible for my mother's illness. Florence's family was unable to offer help. There was no state assistance. So my mother, who's very small, was left with the surrogates, blowing kisses back to Chicago, where my grandmother was. Eventually, my grandmother found childcare at the Chase House Day Nursery, and my mother returned to live with her. That is a picture of the Episcopalian church, which ran the day nursery, which the building of which has been torn down. And the other picture, thank you, Google Earth, is of the apartment that they went to live on South Ashland. Eventually, she found childcare at Chase House, and my mother returned to live with her. But I imagine her life as a single mother was rather hard, with the onset of the Depression even harder. In any event, through I'm not sure what circumstances, my grandmother married again, a man who was a bootlegger, driving between the stills of backcountry Arkansas and Chicago, where they lived. I now understand that Florence had little choice, for she relied on this man's wages. Certainly, a state program guaranteeing the capacity to form and maintain an autonomous household would have made a significant difference for her and her daughter. And I now think that these events are at the heart of the connections among my objects of study, my politics, and my family history. After her service in the Women's Army Corps during World War II, Kathleen returned to Chicago and went to college at Roosevelt and the University of Chicago. Then met my father, married, and left with him to go to San Francisco, where I was born. Only years later did she recount some crucial details that she'd actually been in a PhD program in anthropology at Chicago, but had dropped out when she got pregnant with me. Although I didn't know it at the time when I started my doctorate, I was following in my mother's footsteps, and it was in part her PhD I earned in 1985. Her experiences reflected the gains and losses of many women of her generation, especially in relinquishing her own vocation in order to care for her children. Given what I now know about her life, I have more sympathy for her choice than I did when I was growing up, but I'm very glad not to have been forced to make such a choice myself and to be able to be both professor and mother. I'm indebted to the women who furthered feminism and women's education. The chair that was created out of the funds that the Board of Lady Managers raised, and which initially went to the School of Domestic Arts and Sciences, found their way not just to supporting the chair, but also to a Department of Home Economics, which was disbanded in 1973, just when my classmates and I were rebelling at institutions like Girls Only Home Ec, part of the very ambitious and wide-ranging second-wave feminism's confrontation with gender difference and hierarchy. The endowment of the Board of Lady Managers now supports gender studies scholars, a reflection of the surprising histories of feminism and social justice activism, the diverse ways that they've touched the lives of single mothers, club women, and professors who happen to be women. Thank you.